What's up, everyone? Welcome to the BackMarkers F1 Show podcast. Really glad you could join us here today on this April Monday, actually. We're doing this podcast shortly after the race. Kind of a rare Sunday edition of the podcast here, but actually super happy to be doing it on a Sunday because so many things happened in this 2023 Australian Grand Prix that by the time we do it on Monday or Tuesday, we might have forgotten the entire thing that happened during this race. So I'm Chris Cato, alongside my fellow backmarkers, Tyler McDonald and Shaker Barty in Ottawa, bringing you this podcast. Boys, how are you doing today?
Doing well, doing well. What a interesting Grand Prix, you could say. It went through its lulls and everything like that, but the ending was very topical, as you could say. I don't think I said that right, but anyways, it was an interesting finish.
Yeah, I think surprising for sure. You know, good beginning and good end. I mean, like you said, interesting end. Something not kind of what we were expecting from the Australian Grand Prix because there's not a lot of passes that happen, and there was quite a lot of them. So yeah, overall not what I expected, but a good race overall. But like you said, definitely had its lulls in the middle for sure.
Mm-hmm.
It had quite a few lulls, and also the other thing too is that after the Australian Grand Prix, we're not going to have another race until the end of April on April 28th. So it's about almost a 3-week break from Formula One. So I guess this race was perfect in a sense of which we're almost going to have 3 weeks worth of incidents to talk about in this Grand Prix. But we're going to try and break it down here in the next 45 minutes or so. And I was trying to actually wonder of where we could get started here on this recap podcast, just because so many things happen. So let's maybe try in chronological order, because I know you boys have opinions on everything that happened. So let's begin at the first red flag. And there was multiple of them. So we'll start at the first one. But it was, of course, the Alex Albon crash, which is really unfortunate because Albon was having such a great weekend so far and was running actually in the top 8. It was kind of Williams' best result in the last few years or so. So he was doing really well. And then, of course, he had the crash, almost got collided there with Hülkenberg, who was passing through, and as well as Lance Stroll. But it didn't seem like there was any damage to the barriers. Of course, Albon was okay, got out pretty well. But then the stewards decided to red flag it, which really turned the race on its head. It put George Russell, of course, in a bad luck situation because he had pitted under the safety car, which came out initially. But for the likes of Verstappen and Hamilton and Alonso, they really benefited from staying out. So, Tyler, I'll start with just the simple question here. Was that first red flag necessary? And if you were the race director, what would you have done in that situation?
Quick answer, no, not necessary, in my opinion. I thought, the word from the FIA was that there was too much gravel on the track. I mean, too much gravel on the track. I mean, come on, how is that an excuse? I mean, like, it's gravel. Like, sweep it to the sides. It can't be that hard. Dude, you can have it under a safety car and be able to sweep the gravel off the roads when the car is at the other side of the track. So, in my opinion, no, not a worthy red flag. I thought that was a little trigger happy by the FIA. In my opinion, it should have been just a simple full course safety car, and we would have been back to running in normal ways.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you there. Shouldn't have been a red flag. Should have been a safety car. I know the barrier was out a little bit as well, but still should have been a safety car. There wasn't that much damage or any debris really on the track itself that they couldn't have just cleaned up quickly. And would have been a different situation for the top 3 drivers for sure, maybe the top 6, in terms of if it was a safety car instead of a red flag for sure. I think we would have seen different results from the race overall. But yeah, I don't think it was a red.
It's always difficult because we don't have the data and the information that the race control room does, because they have more information in terms of how much debris was on the track. There was more of a concern, I think, of it being on the racing line, and even if the drivers are coming through there under safety car speeds, still could be an issue. But I agree with you both. I think that first safety car the first red flag was just too trigger happy, because I think it was quite obvious that there wasn't massive barrier damage, of course. And I don't think that there was that much carbon debris either, that it couldn't have been cleared, just like you said there, Tyler, by simply sweeping it off the track. And under safety car speeds, I think there's plenty of time for those marshals to get out there and sweep it under. I even think that there's plenty of time and opportunity for that big sweeper truck to get on the track while the cars are going around at reduced speeds. It was very trigger happy, in my opinion, similar to the Saudi Arabian safety car. We weren't here for that recap podcast, but if you cast your memory back to that race, Lance Stroll had perfectly parked his car at one of the Marshall exit posts, and yet they threw the safety car right into the track. And the FIA said their reasoning was, well, the GPS was showing us that the car was on track. Well, don't you have access to far more cameras and things like that to see that, okay, Lance Stroll's car is well out of the way of any danger? A virtual safety car was plenty more enough to cover that incident. So I think that it was far too early, and it really did change the direction of the race. Now, you could say for George Russell, maybe it wouldn't have mattered in the end because he did have the engine failure that cost him to fail to finish in the race, but it really did put other drivers out of position, like Carlos Sainz in the end. So that was one of the first of, I think, many questionable decisions in the race. So that was really the first red flag. And then afterwards, we had the restart and everything. We get into kind of, like Shaker mentioned off the top of the show there, a lull in the race. Australia, a difficult track to overtake. We saw how powerful the DRS was. Kind of made it a little bit of a more boring race, let's say. Wasn't as exciting in terms of the on-track battles. But now let's get to the second red flag of the race, which I got to say, Kevin Magnussen provided us with one of the most unique crashes I've ever seen in Formula One history. And I didn't even know a tire could do that, to be honest with you, the way he smacked that wall. But he didn't even know what happened until he brought the car to a halt. And then that was really when the whole race almost shifted, because Verstappen was well out in front, 10 seconds ahead. It looked like he had it all wrapped up. And then, boom, we got our second red flag of the day. So I will pose the same question again for the second time in about 5 minutes. Shaker, I'll start with you this time. Do you think that the second red flag was necessary for Magnussen's crash?
I mean, like, it's a hard call. I mean, yes, his car didn't completely make it off the track from what I remember, but also I don't think there was that much debris on the track itself for them to do that. So I should have been a safety car, I think, not maybe a virtual safety car. I don't know. I'm kind of like very on the edge on this one, but I don't think there was that much debris on the track itself, but yeah.
Yeah, like, I don't know. For me, I think it was the right call. I think a red flag is the correct call in that. And let me hear you out. Remember back to Abu Dhabi 2021. There's 2-3 laps left in the race. Nicholas Latifi puts it in the wall. What dramatic thing do we want? We want a red flag to restart the race. Fast forward to this past weekend. Somehow, that was a weird crash by Magnussen. I do want to touch on that. It was like he almost misjudged the wall, because that wall does stick out and then retreat back for like an access area for marshals and stuff. And like it's like he misread that by maybe like a meter, and that's what made him smack the wall. It's really, really weird. But anyways, I think it was the right call for dramatic reasons. I think you can't end the race on safety cars anymore at this day and age in Formula One. There's too many eyes on it, and it leads to a boring finish. And if we had that lull in the race, plus then it finishing under safety car, would have been, oh my God, what a terrible race. Like, now people have the complete opposite opinion on the race. I was talking to someone earlier today who said that, well, that was one of the best races they've watched. And I immediately thought back, okay, well, about Germany a few years back, and there's, I think there's better races personally. But that gives the impression people get from an ending like that is, well, what an amazing race, because of the ending that we had. So yes, I do think it was the right call. Lewis Hamilton did say there was a lot of debris on the track, but to end the race, not red flag the race, which is an interesting call too. I think he felt a lot of pressure from Alonso back. So I think that call was to just end the race under safety car. I'm not sure he was expecting a red flag either. So, if you take a look, there's two different ways of thinking about it. For the drivers, probably don't want a red flag. If you're everyone at home in the grandstands and trying to make money off Formula One, you do want a red flag in that scenario.
But the thing is, Tyler, it did end up ending basically in a virtual safety car situation. So like in the end, didn't matter.
That's
I
so
think it ended
stupid.
up causing more damage to the cars in the end, and like to all the teams, and they still ended up ending in a virtual safety car.
Yeah,
So
Alpine got like a $2 million bill for that
yeah.
red flag.
So I mean, yeah, I get what you're saying though. Like, yes, if there was like 3 laps rest and that, the third red flag didn't happen, then yes, I totally get where you're coming from. But they still ended up and basically ended up in a virtual safety car. So
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. But I guess you don't know that's going to happen. What do you call a red
yeah,
flag,
no, I
right?
totally get where you're coming from
But
though. If that,
it's just funny how
yeah,
it ended. They are trying to avoid that ending and still got that
yeah,
ending.
yeah,
You know what I thought for a second before I get it back to you, Chris, is that I thought that they were going to say, "Oh, we didn't complete a lap. We're actually going to have a 1 lap shootout, like for a standing start, and just have 1 lap to decide it." I thought that's what they were going to do. Honestly, that's what they do in NASCAR. And I thought, oh, maybe they'll pull a page of the NASCAR rulebook, but maybe that's something that they'll change in the future.
Yeah, and I'm glad you guys brought that point up in your responses there, because my next question would have been is, should that race have just finished under a safety car? Now, if you cast your memory back to last year's Italian Grand Prix in 2022, we actually did have the race finish under the safety car when Daniel Ricciardo had to pull over with some sort of a mechanical issue. But that incident was slightly different from the standpoint of it was just a mechanical issue and it was a car that was in an unsafe position. So if you look at the FIA's argument from it, they say that in terms of the Magnussen crash, there was debris on the track. And one of the main issues that the FIA was trying to point up is like, listen, even if there's carbon debris and the cars are going around under safety car speeds, it's still relatively fast. So there's a potential safety hazard of that debris popping up into a driver's face and it being hurt. It could also be something of a driver, running over even at slow speeds and they get a puncture. And then what if they have to pit or they have a mechanical issue and then they lose position anyway? So that is their reasoning behind it. And if you remember that Italian Grand Prix last season, a lot of people were upset that the race finished under the safety car. And it's very interesting, though, because that was around the same time in Italy. It was about 5 laps to go when that safety car came out. So it was very interesting decisions being made. I think there was a lot of confusion as well as the decision making was happening. But I think that we all kind of agree between the three of us that I think we should make the most attempt to finish the race under green flag conditions where possible. So I like that they made that effort to do this in that sense, but I think that there's still a lot of confusion and inconsistency with how the FIA operates here. It seems like on one race they're doing one thing and then the next race they're doing the other. And I know Formula One is a very dynamic sport and you can't necessarily have a rule book and an example for every single situation. I just think it needs to be far more cut and dry of when these incidents come around, they're able to just apply that rule and they know what to do. They kind of just, even while they were trying to decide what to do with that restart, you seemed like, I don't know about this. So I think eventually they did make the right decision. But man, the carnage that followed afterwards was unbelievable. I mean, I really feel for guys like Pierre Gasly, who really got put off by it. And even Carlos Sainz, I know that he used to blame obviously for that accident, but boy, I don't know. I guess we'll talk about that penalty separately. But so I don't know. I mean, what do you think, Tyler? What could the FIA do here? Because it was funny on a weekend where Michael Massey, I think, was the first time he returned back to the paddock since Abu Dhabi 2021. I think a lot of us are kind of starting to realize that he wasn't really the problem per se. Maybe he was just part of the problem.
Yeah, I don't think he is the problem at all. But yeah, I don't. It's interesting. I think they have to have some sort of rule that's cut and dry like NASCAR. And I mean, I don't want to be the North America that preaches, oh, NASCAR, blah, blah, blah.
Do it,
But
because
the
I was going to
way,
bring it up next.
okay, great. Because the way they do it is if the race is going to end under caution or a yellow flag condition, safety car, same thing, they extend the race and say they call it a green, white, checkered. So it goes green, then you take the white flag and a checkered flag. It's a 2 lap shootout, pretty much. Now, they do this over and over and over again until they get a winner. Now, you can't do that in Formula One because obviously of fuel management loads. There's only in NASCAR you can refuel. In Formula One, obviously you can't. So I don't think that's maybe the right way of doing it because you can't go over and over and over again and just create more carnage. So I think there's some sort of modification in there where there is that red flag whether if it's within 3 laps left or something like that, where you restart the race with 2 laps to go or 1 lap to go, and just give it a 1 lap shootout. And then whatever the next flag ends the race, that's it. Then it's over. Which is similar to what they did today in a sense, minus the whole kind of figuring out the restart procedure and then doing 1 lap under the safety car um, to end that. So I don't know. It is a hard kind of topic, and I would be very curious to see what other people think down in the comments below on what they think the best solution would be as well. Chris, what do you think though?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I was going to kind of bring up that NASCAR overtime concept that they're doing. And if you watch North American racing or NASCAR in particular, you're familiar with that. And good point that you brought up there, because in Formula One, it would be a bit more difficult to do something like that. I also just think that it was very weird how they did that extra formation. I think that was just stupid in a way and stuff. I mean, they could have just really called the race in what it was and just continued on like that. But then as we're starting to talk about it and we think about it, there's another side to this, which I would kind of agree with as well, to say, I think every effort should be made to try and restart the race. But I also think that red flags should only be necessary for absolute safety requirements and not for entertainment value. Because I think when you look at the other side of things, like let's take Max Verstappen, for example. He drove a really solid race. He built this 10-second gap. He was just all really needed to just bring the car home. And then all of a sudden, something like that happens, and then you're into red flag conditions, and now the whole race essentially gets neutralized, and he could have lost that race. I mean, he could have been passed by Hamilton. He could have even been passed by Alonso. You never know. So there's that also side to look at it, where you say, well, it could be unfair to some of the drivers out there who, let's say, built up this lead by the great driving that they've done, and then it's all taken away from them. That's a fair point too, but that's motorsport. These things happen. I mean, look at the safety car in Abu Dhabi, right? It was just luck. Well, of course, I know it depends who you ask. It might be something else, but Latifi crashes and then that happens. So it's very difficult. I think the only thing that I'm just trying to, my point about this whole thing before we move on, is we want to see the consistency, and we also want to see certainty from the FIA stewards that this is what we're doing in these situations, and that they're clean and they're coherent and they're quick with their decision making. I just felt like in Australia, again, they were kind of like making it up as they go. And I've gotten that sense in the last few races of this season too.
Yeah, it seems like it's more like you mentioned, Chris, it's more about entertaining people, and with the amount of people they are getting to watch than it is about than it is about just finishing the race at that point. And I think they realized what they did in Abu Dhabi provided entertainment and got a lot of people to watch. So, having three championship winners in the top three in the red, in a restart in the last 2 laps makes a lot of entertainment value. So yeah, no, I see where you're coming from.
It's gonna look great on Drive to Survive.
Hey, you could work for the FIA.
Hey, if they want to pay me very well, I'll gladly work for them.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Tyler doing his best race director impression right there. Like, excuse me, race director, what should we do in this situation? Well, red flag. That'll be really good for Drive to Survive. Red flag it is.
Red flag it is.
Yeah. That's a great point you bring up there, Shaker, though. I mean, we have to remember this is a sport. And I heard a great quote over the weekend where they say the only time Formula One is a sport when the lights go out and the cars start to actually race out on the track. And even then, sometimes it doesn't seem like a sport. So that's a really good point. And I'm 100% in agreement there that these decisions need to be made with the racing and the regulations in mind and not the entertainment value. I know that the ending under the safety car isn't entertaining. And I know that people complain probably one way or another, and doesn't matter what they do. But I think that we need to keep the spirit of the sport in mind and not the Netflix viewership or the TV numbers or anything like that. Because this is a sport at the end of the day. And I think that Formula One, especially in terms of the management, needs to be reminded of that.
Yeah, I think there is a fine balance there that the FIA need to find. It's just finding that balance. And that's just going to happen through trial and error. They're going to learn from mistakes that they make, and they'll hear flack from it from the drivers and everything like that. And well, hopefully, next time the decision comes, it'll be the right decision.
Well, you hope so. I mean,
Sorry, I didn't say that. I do think it was the right decision this race. So I don't know. It depends which way you look at it, right? That's the thing is that there's in the end it's a business and you have a business to make money. Yes, it's a sport as well, but any sport also is a business and it goes for entertainment value. Whether it's the NFL, if it's the Champions League, if it's the NBA, anything like that, it's all about making money and creating entertainment. So what's going to make the most entertainment in that situation, in my opinion, that created the most entertainment, which is going to create the more business, and in the end, more money for the drivers, the teams, and everyone else involved. So it's
I just
tricky.
feel like sorry, I'll let you finish.
No, that's it. That was it.
I was gonna say, I just feel like the last 2 years they've had virtual safety cars and yellow flags and red like yellow flags for less less issues that were more of a safety issue, you know? Like I feel like last year when George Russell had that huge crash is when we really saw that red card come through, right? Or then sorry, red flag come through. Where like this year for to have three red flags come through on one race, which we saw three overall last year, is a huge surprise, especially for only in the third race of the season. So
Yeah, no,
hopefully we
100%.
get consistency throughout the season as well. So.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think I agree. I think we all agree the first red flag should have been a red flag. And I'm not sure the other. I think I don't understand that one. But yeah, it's interesting. It's a can of worms, and I wonder what will happen in the future.
And really, it's going to come down to that next driver meeting in Baku, Azerbaijan for the next race. Because if you heard some of the radio reaction from the drivers, especially Fernando Alonso, it was quite shocking when they dropped that red flag for the final time at the Australian Grand Prix. So maybe there is no right answer here. I'm kind of torn in between, but yeah, comment section is wide open for you guys down there to let us know what you think of the FIA stewarding. What do you think of the red flags dropping there? Should we have ended the race there under the safety car? Let us know what you think. Just to continue on, because there's so much madness that we do have to talk about that when we actually got to that second restart. I mean, it's just action all over the place in the first two corners. And some of the big losers, of course, were the Alpines. Both of them were running excellent positions, especially Pierre Gasly was in contention for driver of the day before that accident. And then that really ended all quite dramatically. But I think the other side of this, too, is you have to look at these types of things are going to happen with 2 laps to go. Everybody's going to go for it. I think this is very different than a race start on lap 1 where everybody knows they got a full Grand Prix ahead of them, so you kind of take some caution. But when there's only 2 laps to go, then you're going to take a lot more risks. And it seems like a lot of drivers took risks because I don't know what was the final count. We lost 5 or 6 cars just in the span of 2.5 corners. But Carlos Sainz was the huge loser out of that one because he tagged Fernando Alonso and then he got the 5-second penalty, which really sucked because all the cars are right behind him. So he dropped out of the points. Do you think that penalty for Sainz was a little too harsh in the end, or was it deserved?
Well, what's the most minor penalty you can get?
That
Five
one that he
second
got.
penalty. So uh, then no, I don't think it's too harsh because there's nothing you can go that's less than that. You can't go after the race and say, oh, he loses one position because he screwed that up. It's 5 second penalty. He shouldn't have driven to the side of Alonso. Like, I'm sorry. That's his mistake. Mistakes happen. And it sucks that for him in that scenario, he drove a great race that he ends up losing 8 positions because it ends up under safety car. Now, and maybe that's why the race had to be finished under the safety car like it was to put those 5 seconds in because it's hard to put a 5 second time stamp in on a standing start. So I don't know how they would have done that either, unless they gave him a grid penalty for the next race. That could have been the other option as well. But I mean, just bad luck for Carlos Sainz, unfortunately. But he's the one that caused the accident, and in the end, which ended up, spidering into 1,000 other different accidents that happened at the end of that race as well.
Yeah, and if that's a minimal penalty, I think it's well deserved, and because that was basically just a trigger for 5 other cars to basically go out in the last 2 laps of the race. So ruined a bunch of bunch of drivers' race as well as cost, like you mentioned, Alpine $2 million in the final lap of the race. So
Yeah, that's brutal for Alpine. That's a tough. They were. I'm sure you guys were listening. They were interviewing Otmars, and he was very positive for what the situation he was dealing with. I would have been losing my mind.
Gasly sure was. I just watched the post race reaction video from F1, and he was just it was like somebody had died or something was his reaction to that race, and he took full responsibility for it. Which obviously, I mean, it was just kind of one of those tough things. I wouldn't say that it wasn't as bad as science. There, we'll get back to him in just a second. But
Yeah.
good news for Gasly is that he didn't get any penalty points, which was kind of surprising actually, because I thought that he would have with the way the FIA has been going as of late. And that would have meant a race ban because he's right on the precipice of a race ban with the penalty points that he has. So he's gotten really lucky there. So I
Wow.
think that yeah, he's on I think it's 12 for a race ban and he's on 10 or 11, something like that. But basically one more infraction and he gets a race ban. So he's not out of the woods yet. And I think it's another month or two until some of those old points start to shave off. So I was surprised personally he didn't get a penalty point for that, just because it was dangerous the way he kind of came back onto the track slowly. But yeah, I guess they didn't want to punish him too badly. They thought losing a P5 was hard enough for Gasly.
Yeah, and costing his team another position with Ocon too. So that's fair. I can understand that, but I didn't realize how close it was to a ban. But yeah, just go back on Carlos Sainz here. So he finished 6.5 seconds back of Max Verstappen. I don't know if you noticed, but Lance Stroll was kind of like, I don't know if he was trying to help Sainz out at all, but he was kind of lagging back to maybe give a bigger gap to the drivers behind Stroll. Obviously, Stroll was
Yeah,
behind Sainz. And it kind of looked like, oh, maybe he's helping Sainz out. And then you saw everyone speeding across the line behind Stroll to trying to get into that 5 second territory for Sainz. And obviously, it ended up working because all other, 11 other um, drivers who were still running at the time all passed Carlos Sainz. And I was just looking, Sonoda had zero point 0.5 half a second to spare, and getting a race point there. So yeah, it's unfortunate for Carlos, but at the same time, he made the mistake and caused that issue. So it's just whether or not you want to decide if it's 5 seconds worthy or if it's a grid penalty at the next race.
I think 5 seconds is worthy with how Ferrari's doing. I think a grid penalty would have pretty much ruined their entire season.
I think that was done after this weekend pretty much.
Yeah,
Done after
but
the
and
first
we didn't
lap,
really.
first turn.
Yeah, well, that's what I was just about to say. Your first turn, Charles Leclerc got obviously sent into the gravel, and no fault of anyone there. It's a racing incident, but just more bad luck for Ferrari in Leclerc and Carlos Sainz. I mean, just that's just been a tough few years for them, hasn't it?
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, though, you have to look at it and say, like you said, Tyler, it is the fault of the driver. It is Carlos Sainz who got out of shape and made the contact with Fernando Alonso. So that's, and all those other drivers too, most of them, some that had the contact on the restart. I think it was important for them to try and stay clear and clean like some of the other drivers did. And that's their fault at the end of the day. But that's what happens when you try and go for it with only 2 laps to go. So, yeah, I mean, you really felt for Carlos Sainz, and they had the camera on him in the pit lane right away when he got the news, and you just saw it in his eyes, and yeah, exactly, he was pretty upset, which was interesting to see how that kind of all transpired. But yeah, I mean, it was a crazy restart. I don't know who else got into some incidents there on the restart. I know we had the two Alpines.
Um,
We of course had Alonso, which I'm really glad that the penalty got. Oh, actually, sorry. I'm
Stop.
jumping around here a little bit, but I remember now the point that I wanted to make here, going back to our argument of whether that the decision to revert the positions back was the right one or not. I'm just going to say it wasn't the right one because Nico Hulkenberg was that close to his maiden podium because had the order stayed after all the crashes and Sainz gets his penalty, Nico Hulkenberg would have been third.
yeah, that's a good point. Damn, that would have been worth it, no matter what. Oh, it's too bad. That's a great point, Chris.
Speaking of Nico Hulkenberg, when that first lap, when he went off the gravel and everything that happened in that first lap, I just immediately was like, man, if this is the race where he starts like P4, what was it? No, P6? He started out pretty high. And then like his entire race is ruined just because going off the gravel and crashing the wall. I would have been in like heartbroken for him.
Yeah, he had a good race. He had actually a pretty good weekend too and scored his first points for Haas, which was good. But yeah, it was funny because you saw like two drivers just unexpectedly. Sonoda was in fifth, and then Hulkenberg was sitting there in fourth, and yeah, would have had the podium because that was like none of the commentators were bringing it up when that whole thing was going on, and I'm like, guys, like you realize how close we are to Hulkenberg podium because I knew that that penalty was probably going to go to Sainz. There's no way they weren't going to look at that. So eventually, it would have been really close. But I mean, Nico did score some points anyway once we got the final order in there. So yeah, that was the crazy restart. Way at the back, you had Logan Sargent, double
Yeah.
lockup, took out Nick DeVries. So kind
Plow
of
into the back of Nick DeFries. Like, it was all.
yeah. But it was similar to what we saw all weekend. Cooler temperatures, a lot of drivers struggling for grip entire warm up, and I think that was the issue too with the space pace behind the safety car. Max Verstappen in particular complaining just how slow it was. And I don't know if you guys remember this. I'm not sure exactly which restart it was under because we had so many. But remember when Lewis Hamilton really slowed down the field, and then we went to
Yeah.
the shot of like all the cars, almost. I think that's what you were just mentioning there, Shaker. You had, I think, one of the Hasses, whether it was Hulkenberg or Magnussen, completely went into the gravel,
Yeah.
but they almost had 2, 3 cars run into each other.
Yeah, it completely slowed down. I think it was everybody behind Lance Stroll, I think it was just almost went off, or everybody behind it was P6 or whatever position that was. But yeah, but
Yeah, it was,
apparently you're allowed to do that.
well, yeah, it was the right decision from Lewis, but it was just weird how it all kind of, I don't know, stacked up at the back, and yeah, it got very dangerous at the back of the grid there. But Lewis was right; he could do whatever he wants there,
Yeah,
technically under. So he did nothing wrong. Um, yeah, very. It reminded me, what was that? What race was that where they all, it was Bottas's fault where they all plowed into each other during a restart on the
Oh, in
starting.
Mugello.
Yes, Mugello. Yes, yeah,
Yeah, we had like
that's what it
three
all was
red
turned
flags
out.
there too.
I think so.
Yeah, what an eventful race. I mean, so many crazy things happened. But let's talk a little bit about the results in the end instead of all the informalities and the craziness. Of
Well,
course,
Chris,
Verstappen.
I want to know if you're wearing that Aston Martin hat just to get a little bit more luck on your side, because they are the luckiest people in the world at getting a P3 and P4 out of that race.
Well, they are, and I honestly, I felt really bad for them had the decision gone the other way because once again, Alonso drove a good race, Lance Stroll drove a solid race, and then it would have all ended there in that one corner. But eventually went better for them because now P3, P4, and now sitting second in the constructor standings, a really decent points clear of Mercedes as well in third. So very lucky. And Fernando Alonso, we're starting to get used to this. Aston Martin on the podium, first 3 races of the season. Alonso's first time being on the podium in 3 consecutive races since 2013. And he's been really making a habit of it this year. And I thought that P2 was in with the shot at this race, but Lewis did have a pretty good pace in that Mercedes and was managing the gap very well. So I think Aston Martin, one of the disadvantages to their car this season, and it doesn't have many because it's a good car, but it is quite draggy. And we saw that a little bit in Jeddah, but in particular, this race with 4 DRS zones, we saw that their car is a little bit slower in the straight lines, but still it has excellent cornering grip and really good out of the corners as well. So another podium for Alonso. I thought it was brilliant. And we talked about this in the first podcast, and we would have talked about it in the last one too. I love what he's bringing to this season so far. And I just love the fact that it seems like with Ferrari kind of out of the picture now, he's going to be in with the shot at a podium almost every race. Now it's just kind of a matter of time and luck until he gets to P2 and hopefully eventually P1.
And hopefully
absolutely.
it's the same for his teammate Lance Stroll. I mean, we'd like to see him do well, as well. So we'll go ahead, Shaker. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I no for sure. I was just gonna say that. I was gonna ask you guys, do you think that was Sergio Perez's like best drives that he's ever done? Because he went from P20 to P5, had some great overtakes. I think it was like the 3 or 4 laps in the middle over the I think it was Lando Norris. I can't remember who it was, but it was like 3 drivers, almost 3 or 4 laps in a row that he just overtook them.
Yeah, I thought it was a really good Sergio Perez drive, obviously top three. I don't know if
Yeah.
I don't know if it's number one because there was it Secure where he raced last to first.
Yeah.
So it is that one. Okay, so that one I still think is his best drive. If he would have won today, I would have said absolutely it's his best drive. Um, but I think it's a top three for sure. I mean, he had a phenomenal race. He was very aggressive in his overtakes, and seemed to have a really good whatever brake issue he had during practice and qualifying. Seemed to get that figured out in the race because he was very confident on them.
Well, apparently they changed his setup around after qualifying. They changed
Uh,
so they changed everything that he was complaining about, because I think yeah, the brakes and whatever issues they ended up changing both around right before the race. So
Interesting.
He's kind of made a habit of those recovery drives. I think it's a lot easier too with the fact that he has the fastest car underneath him. But Australia is not an easy track to overtake, even though it has four DRS ones now, so that really favored Red Bull. But it was a shame too because he's really kind of the only next to Verstappen title contender this season. And third race of the year, he has that issue. Okay, the points gap wasn't as big in the end, but still unfortunate for him. So yeah, we'll see how that really kind of develops as we go into the next few races, which kind of brings me to another question that I had for you guys. And we saw this was the first race of the year. I know we've only had three races, but the first race of 2023 in which the gap seemed just a little bit closer. Now, I know Verstappen had that mistake at the penultimate chicane, which kind of cut down the gap. I mean, he was well out in front, 10 seconds or so. But I'm just saying, in terms of Mercedes, looked a lot stronger. And even the Ferrari race pace was actually quite good in the hands of Carlos Sainz. He was keeping on tabs with Fernando Alonso and was lapping at times even as fast as Lewis Hamilton. So some people were out there considering like, okay, maybe it's starting to get a little bit closer here. Personally, I think that this was more track specific than anything. We had a lot cooler temperatures in Melbourne. We didn't even have air temperature that went over 20 degrees until race day. And I think that those cooler temperatures might have favored some teams, in particular the Mercedes. I think that Lewis and George Russell nailed their setup really well, which has favored them around this track. But I think Australia is one of those tracks, and we've seen this in recent years, where it's very unique. It's not like many of the other circuits that we go to, so that we see sometimes these anomalies happen. But what do you guys think, just quickly on that? I mean, do we think it's going to get a little bit closer in the next couple of races, or are we going to see more of the same here, which is Red Bull out in front dominating? Are Mercedes trying to make a comeback here, or have they figured out something with their car before they bring upgrades? What were your senses watching that weekend?
Well, I think obviously the Red Bulls are so dominant in on the straights, and we've had two. We could argue three with Bahrain, but I'd say two very um, you know straight line speed heavy tracks in Saudi Arabia and Australia. And I say Saudi Arabia because it is very fast with obviously a lot of high speed corners, but there are some very very long straights there as well. And Azerbaijan, I think, is going to be a little bit of the same. That street circuit's got that really really long front straight that I think the Red Bulls are going to be just super super dominant on. I don't think it's going to be until maybe Miami. I would say, when they go to Imola in round six, I thought I could see it becoming a lot closer. And then you have Monaco, Spain is not a top heavy, very speed heavy track. Um, Austria, Great Britain. I think the middle of the schedule it might favor the other teams a little bit, but I mean, if you take a look, I think the Red Bulls are going to dominate in Baku. Miami is going to be interesting. I'm not 100% sure how it'll shake out. It's only the second race there. Canada, I think, will be a Red Bull um, as well. And then you have Belgium, Hungary, Italy, straight line speed there. Well, not so much Netherlands, but it's Max's home track, so he'll probably dominate. So, I mean, it's going to be an interesting balance here to see if it will come closer. Obviously, Alonso's very confident that it will be closer, and I think that um, and Lewis is kind of knows it'll be hard work, but you can see the confidence behind the Mercedes team a little bit after this weekend. So I think there's some positives going forward in terms of getting that gap a little closer to Red Bull.
yeah, like I like you mentioned, I think it is very track specific. But what was really interesting to see when both the Mercedes were ahead of the Red Bull in the beginning of the race, Red Bull, just for the fact that they ended up getting DRS and Jordan Russell was keeping pace with Lewis and not going all the way up ahead, which I don't think he really could. Red Bull was struggling a little bit, so it's nice to see that wheel-to-wheel racing and how the drafting and the DRS is kind of taking a little more effect and they're getting clean air through the cars. So I think it will get closer in the gap, especially we'll probably see more after the summer break with the upgrades that they do bring. Um, and I think it's going to be definitely more from Aston Martin and Mercedes than it is Ferrari, because I think F1 Data Analysis put out a thing just a few days ago saying the second gaps that they made from the 2022 cars, and I think Ferrari is the one that's made the least amount of time around the track at Australia compared to last year. So it's a try to see, but I think it will be a little bit closer within Mercedes and Aston Martin for sure.
That'll most likely be the battle for second, I think, and maybe if Ferrari can get in there with their upgrades, we'll see. I think Mercedes were talking about bringing almost a whole new car concept within the next couple of races. I don't know how much they could do that with the current budget cap, but they are bringing upgrades. But the car seems okay. Again, I think, like you guys said, in my initial thoughts too, it's more track specific. But Red Bull is the clear runner out in front now. And like you said, Tyler, I think around the summertime is when we'll see things start to get a little bit closer. Remember, Red Bull has the least amount of wind tunnel and aero testing allowances this year, plus the extra 10% with that penalty that they got for breaching the cost cap. So I think that we'll start to see them slow down a little, which is why I think they're so keen on dominating the first little bit of this season so that they can build that points cushion and eventually not have to worry about teams catching them, similar to Braun in 2009. But I think this will be a little bit more comfortable for them. And that means that a team like Aston Martin, who has quite a few more aerodynamic allowances, they'll be able to maybe get in with a few wins here or there toward the end of the season, hopefully. But I think that we'll see a three-team fight for second at least. But it's clear that Red Bull is out in front. And the bad news for us fans out there is I don't think any other team right now will be able to battle for the championship. And if it does happen in 2023, it might be too little too late for a competitive championship, which is kind of disappointing. So it's just the way that it is, but I think it could shape up for an interesting 2024. Who knows? We can only hope, at least, I guess. But that's just the thoughts on some of the car performances there. Just some special mentions. I have one question that I want to get to, which is not necessarily related to Australian Grand Prix, but we'll wrap up with that one. But first, some honorable mentions there. McLaren, they entered this weekend last in the constructor standings, and they have a really nice jump up the leaderboard after double points finished. Helped, of course, with all the incidents. But Oscar Piastri getting his first points in Formula One at his home race, a very well-driven race. And he's been driving very well so far to start the season, despite McLaren's struggles, showing that the replacement for Ricciardo was actually a good move. And Lando Norris, as well, as you mentioned, Shaker, in his battle with Sergio Perez, was holding him off really well for a bunch of laps. And he drove an excellent race. So it's good to see McLaren get off the leaderboard there. And they really needed this type of weekend.
Absolutely. I mean, he kind of felt good for Piastri to get points at his home track in his debut at home. It was awesome. So, no, slowly but surely that McLaren car is coming around. It is so draggy. It might be the slowest car on the grid in terms of straight line speed. So a lot of work has to be done there on the McLaren side. But I mean, Lando had some good laps. He was keeping good pace as well, as you mentioned. So, no, some positives to take out for McLaren.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that they've got a lot of work to do until, I mean, at least the mid-season point where they're bringing these upgrades that they were talking about. But it's been a rough start to life at McLaren so far. But Piastri on the board with his first points in Formula One. So a really good race for him. And that was nice to see him get it at home too. So that was good. But overall, a solid Australian Grand Prix. In terms of the on-track action, wasn't the most exciting, but we certainly got a lot in terms of the entertainment value. So maybe the boxes were ticked in Melbourne. So do you guys have anything else from the Grand Prix before we move on to just some other F1 related stuff that was outside of this race weekend? Anything you wanted to bring up?
I think the track changes they made were a phenomenal idea. The track race is so much better now than what it did before. So just kudos to the Australian Grand Prix organizers for making those changes.
I have nothing to say.
Perfect. It certainly did spice up some of the racing too, and the little chicanes that they got rid of was a good choice. So, yeah, Australia Grand Prix at the Albert Park circuit on the calendar for many more years to come. So it's always a nice stop on the calendar here in the early part of the season. So what I'll finish with is a question that I wanted to pose to you guys because I saw this actually before we went into the weekend in Melbourne, and it was some comments by F1 CEO Stefano Domenicali, and I think it was during some sort of interview where he was talking about free practice and the potential or the desire to eliminate free practice as a whole. In some of the recent things that he was saying is that in the near future we might see free practice in Formula One just gotten rid of altogether. And I don't know if the idea is to have more sprint races, more races in general, or just qualifying and the race, a 2-day weekend. I'm not sure, but I certainly had plenty of opinions of this at the time, just reading some of the quotes and the headlines as well. But I wanted to ask you guys this because I think it was a very interesting topic that even some of the drivers talked about. So, Tyler, what would you think about that, of getting rid of free practice altogether in Formula One?
I personally wouldn't be a fan, and that's for the reason of, if you go as a fan, some people can't afford race day tickets or qualifying day tickets. Some people go, to the Friday to be able to see their cars go around the track, general admission, be able to get to the track, and those are the days where you can actually get tickets most for a lot now. So, I think that would deter a lot of fans who would love to go see Formula One but can't afford the race or qualifying or anything like that. I think that would be a bad decision in that case. But the policy you could swing from is that it create more chaos on race day where no one would know what their setup is like. And I don't think that's good for racing. If you don't know, don't get the right setup for your car and car's not handling well, I just don't think that would create good racing. So I don't agree with it personally.
No, I don't agree with it either. And I feel like it is to bring probably more sprint races into F1. But free practice is not, and like you mentioned, for the fans is great too. For like it's a cheaper day to go, but free practice is more definitely for the teams to build up their cars and test out for the track itself. And if that gets taken away, it does create a lot more chaos on race day. And like it kind of just leaves them to find what their setup's going to be in qualifying. And there's not a whole lot of time in qualifying in the end. That you go out for a lap. A few laps, test out your car, and you have to go back, and you basically have like 30 seconds in the end to get it, which kind of makes qualifying more chaotic as well. But no, I don't think it's the best idea. And it's funny with just like I guess motorcycle racing just introduced sprint racing as well this year, or for a few of them as well. And I was just talking to one of my coworkers who's like a huge into motorcycle racing, and he was like, "Oh, I'm not sure how I feel about it, but like it seems like an exciting way to do it." And I've kind of like brought up my opinion. I'm like, you know what? I feel like the race is kind of just decided on sprint race, at the sprint race, and the actual race isn't as exciting anymore. Like the build up to the race is kind of gone. But if they take away free practice and introduce a sprint race, it's kind of just more of a huge thing for fans that they're doing and less for the sport itself, I think. But we'll see where they decide to go with it. Not a fan. This is what I want to get at.
Like, I don't know, maybe if they eliminate practice 3, and just keep Fridays as practice, Thursday is qualifying, or sorry, Friday practice, Saturday qualifying, and Sunday's the race. Like, maybe that's an option. But I think you have to have at least 2 practices, personally.
Yeah. But I feel like if they are going to do that, then they should have the fact that their reserve drivers should be doing more of the testing, or like not having your number 1 and 2 drivers doing the entire thing and testing out the cars if they want to go about that and make more chaos in the end. But yeah.
We talking about practice?
Fuck shit up.
Alan Emerson.
I hope people will get that reference, but I don't know. I mean, it's not a big fan of Domenicali since he's taken over. He's just, and I know why he's doing it. Of course, we mentioned this earlier in the show. It's about the money and it's about the revenue being generated. So they're going to do things that they think at least is going to generate the most money and the most viewers and attract the most of the Netflix audience. But I mean, you can't get rid of practice because Formula One is soon turning into a sport in which the athletes in said sport barely get time to practice. I mean, imagine telling that to a footballer or a tennis player or a hockey player that, hey, we're going to get rid of practice and you're just going to show up on game day and the best that you can do. I mean, that's not going to go over well with the athletes. And I know that practice isn't the most exciting, but Tyler, you brought up the point right off the bat, which was exactly what I was going to say. Is most fans only get that chance to go to that Friday session and watch 60 minutes of practice sessions. Obviously, it used to be a lot more with them being 90 minutes. So you got 3 hours of F1 action. And look at Canadian fans, for example. I mean, most Canadians are only able to attend that one race a year in Montreal. And you want to show up to the track and be able to see as much cars running on track as possible. And if you eliminate the practice, you're not going to see as much. You're only going to see 1 hour qualifying and maybe, that 2 hour race. That's not enough for me. And guarantee you that they're going to end up charging even more money than they are right now for race day tickets, which it's already insane with the prices they're charging. So I don't like it at all. We already have minimal amounts of testing. And I know that's all for cost cap and things like that. But I know some of the drivers came out over the weekend. George Russell in particular said that he'd be okay with getting rid of practices, but I'm just not sure. I mean, obviously it doesn't matter for us in the end. We're not driving the cars, but it just seems like for a sport that's so technical and that's so much about feel and experience, F1 drivers practice the least out of any athlete of any sport that I could think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't know many other leagues or professions where you don't practice. So, I mean, also, I know there's a lot of sim time and stuff like that, but I mean, I've never been in a sim. Obviously, they're realistic, but there can't be anything like driving the circuit and getting it, getting the weekend experience of getting your ideas of the track. So, what do? You throw some F2 rookie with no practice into Saudi Arabia where he's never raced before or something like that. Like, I don't know. That doesn't make any sense to me. Obviously, he needs practice to go around the track and figure out his bearings. So, yeah, I don't know how that's going to work.
Yeah, and overall, over the weekend, they burnt rubber onto the track as well and create more grip. When Saudi Arabia, when first came out a couple years ago and no cars had ever raced on it, cars were slipping all over the place. So if you're just going to go right into qualifying, I feel like there's going to be a lot more that the teams don't know for the results, and they're not going to completely know how to set up the car because it's going to change over the race as it goes. So I don't know.
Good point too. Didn't think about that. That's another element to it. But Verstappen not a fan of the F1 sprints, as we know. We brought that up just a few minutes ago. He reiterated those thoughts over this past weekend in Australia, saying that he feels just as a driver that in the sprints he's not really there for racing. He's just kind of there to take care of the car and just be careful because he doesn't want to do any serious damage that would compromise his race on Sunday. So the sprints are a whole nother topic that we've discussed before, and I'm sure we're going to keep discussing as we get to more and more sprint races being added onto the calendar this season. But I'm not a fan of it. Again, it's just another one of those scenarios of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Maybe you could consider getting rid of free practice 3 and just do some sort of a quick warm-up session on Saturday before qualifying. But I think you do have to keep the fans in mind here, but also the drivers. I just feel like I'm going to come out in defense of the drivers and say that they do need their practice time. I think reducing the 90-minute practice sessions to 60 minutes was a good idea. It's more compact, but listen, not everything has to be so exciting that the consumer out there has to be glued to his TV every day. I mean, I know we're hardcore F1 fans. I try and watch every practice session that I can in its entirety. But listen, if you don't want to watch the practice sessions on your TV at home, then you don't watch them, and that's okay. But you have to keep in mind the fans that go to the track and that pay the hundreds of dollars or euros to be there. They want to see F1 cars running. It's a rarity. You're not going to see Formula One cars every day in your life unless you're actually working the sport. So you want to see it as much as you can when you go, when you pay your hard-earned money. And if you get rid of those and you start to just minus down the minutes that we see on track running, I don't know how much people are going to be worth spending with all that money, to go and see that.
But I just thought of this, and this, if they decide to get rid of free practice and do like 2 qualifying days where they have like one day where the top 20 cars race and then have like the second day be like a qualifying sprint race where the top 10 drivers have to kind of race it out to see what times are going to be. If they're thinking of just like a brand new format like that, maybe I would be interested in sprint race, like have like a mini qualifying session where the top 10s just like duke it out over like 15 laps to find out what their pole position is going to be. That would be interesting. You know, less damage to cars because there's less cars on the track actually racing for a sprint race. But if they're just getting rid of free practice and just having the same format that they have now, I feel like would just be a complete waste in everyone's part. So I genuinely just think qualifying needs to change. I think that's what needs to come. I'm not a huge fan of the qualifying format in general, but that's just me.
Yeah, it certainly can be improved, but I mean, they're no short of ideas to try and fix things or at least improve things in their mind. But who knows what kind of ideas we're going to get in the next couple of months. So yeah, it should be interesting. So let us know what you guys think of. Are you a fan of? Should we get rid of free practice or should we keep it? Or should maybe comment your own weekend formats in the comments below, and maybe some of it will be heard. But yeah, that really does it then on my end here. My notes for this podcast. If you guys have anything else that you want to get out there in the world while we're on the air, the floor is yours.
No, dude. Enjoy the long break before we get real crazy into the schedule. We got, of course, Baku coming up on the 30th of April, and then it's a back-to-back with the Miami Grand Prix, which is kind of crazy to go from Azerbaijan to the USA, then back over to Italy. Then it's another back-to-back to back. Oh, it's a triple one after that with Italy, Monaco, and Spain. So lots of Formula One coming your way, but enjoy the little break while you can. Then.
Yeah, I certainly will.
Yeah, exactly.
Big build up in like April and May and June too. It should be pretty good. So.
Yeah, it's going to be the full sprint then until the summer break. So yeah, weird how they kind of scheduled that out. But anyways, yeah, you won't be seeing us then for at least another 2 or 3 weeks or so. But who knows? Maybe if we get some ideas along the break, we'll record some sort of a special podcast. Maybe something will happen in between then, or we'll just come up with something if we get bored and we want to put some content out. But we will be having content, of course, coming out on the channel in the next few weeks or so. I'm actually just working on some video topic ideas, just maybe some historical things that we could put out there in the meantime, little features. So if you got any video ideas, of course, comment those as well. But you will be hearing from us in the next couple of weeks. Don't you worry. But do enjoy a little bit of a break from Formula One after quite an intense start to the season. I know that we will as well. And we can't wait for the next race in Baku. And we can't wait to have your company on the next BackMarkers F1 Show podcast. We really enjoyed doing this episode with you guys, Tyler and Shaker. I appreciate you guys coming on again. Thank you for all your inputs and your opinions, as always. Really great that we have another excellent race to talk about, and always a pleasure to be joined here with all of our fans around the world. And thank you for your continued support on the BackMarkers F1 Show channel, approaching that 10,000 subscriber mark on YouTube. So please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and continue watching and supporting the BMF1 Show all across social media and on YouTube as well. So for Tyler and for Shaker, I've been Chris Cato on this episode. 3 weeks from now, we'll be seeing us soon, but enjoy the break until then. Until next time, guys, it's bye for now. Take care.